everybody. There's still people coming in. Yeah, just have a seat. Welcome. It's great to see you in such a high numbers. Can you hear me? Oh, no. No. Okay. I think it's good afternoon. Well, good afternoon. It's great to see you in such a great number. Still more people online. So welcome to you. My name is Michael, I'm a senior and for being of Africa. And I'm very presenting the speaker, Professor Táíwò. And well, I think he doesn't need any introduction, but before he's professor of African political thought and chair of studies in the Third Center of Cornell. Well, he has written a lot of books on different political issues of political theory. But I think he's mainly known for this newest book. I think it's the newest one, Against Decolonization, taking everything seriously. When I came across the book, I was really thrilled because it was really needed critical point in the debate on decolonization, and it was often just empty shell decolonization, just anything anymore. But then Professor Táíwò really asking right questions to bring the debate alive again. And I think there was one someone who wrote it that we need a more sophisticated analysis of continuity ideas between Africa and the Western world. And I think that's indeed what it is. So really happy that it's here with us today. And Professor Táíwò, the floor is yours. You will give plenty of time for questions. Okay.
Good afternoon. Good afternoon. Okay, I do know that the applause doesn't have number. That's fine. But you need not say hello to me. To you. First, I want to thank the center for giving me the honor of asking me to come and be part of the conversation. I want to thank John William and Martin for all the work that he has done. Anyone who has had to organize anything with me virtually, the first thing they discover is my email etiquette. And he has been gracious in all the so thank you very much for that. I had a master class with him. I just put him into some faculty earlier today. And it was a fantastic session for me. I hope they will so be with me. Actually educated by some of what I got. So I'm looking forward to a similar outcome at the end of this talk. And to all of you who have decided to spend part of the afternoon with me, I'm really honored. I hope that when this is over, you don't feel that your time has been wasted. And I always say that everyone gives talk when I'm talking to people who don't know me, who possibly don't even know the kind of work that I do, but take a chance, spending their time. So thank you very much. The title of the talk is Africa's Second Struggle for Freedom. What's the organization got to do with it? Why is this one going? I have 3 hours 45 minutes. You don't want to be in that. Because I'm not able to get to see those juicy parts. Okay. I want you to pay close attention to the second half of the title. What's decolonization got to do with it? Of course, that's a really delayed in term. And I chose this precisely, in other contexts, I would say it a different way. But for this audience, the reason why I think if I have autonomous silence, putting a suit together and all that, that's the point where we get to a kind of call response, and now we also read out something and then you say, what's the colonization to do with it? But we're not going to have that. But that idea is the second. And for the first part of the title, I'm going to make clear this now. I talked about the first struggle for freedom, and now I say what is going on is the second struggle for freedom. And it is this second struggle for freedom that I think some in the decolonizing industry are just trying hard, but they're muddying the waters by trying to see this as a decolonization movement. Because for some reason, they believe that when independence was won, with colonialism and argument is if colonization is continued, somebody has to make the case, and they don't make the case. And the way they make the case today is to look at aspects of life. Life is led after independence. And wherever we find elements in that life that seem to mimic what was happening under colonialism, they then say that evidence. So that is where the ex-colonial, unpaid forever paid under colonialism, and not permitted, and the children works carefully to take, adopt, accept any part of any kind of life that is there in that colonialism. Because to do so is to continue to be colonized. My argument is when you do that, first, you deny the privilege that all human people of choosing, embracing, sometimes of wickedness, sometimes of sinning, sometimes of no good at all. Whatever they want from the human inheritance that they want to generate. The second part is every time I feel that something that looks like what's happening after colonialism is still there after colonialism, therefore the causality of colonialism that is inadequate for the most part is often not true, and no case is made for that. And the reason, as I said in the book, is there may be other explanations beyond continued colonialism for why those things are consistent. One big explanation, and is sometimes people are just almost blasé about it, and they don't keep forgetting them, they don't answer questions, they don't. Sometimes it is active engagement. Sometimes it is engagement that is not really possible. And sometimes it is people just being impressed by a whole lot of flaws, and they just want to be a part of that. And these are all possibilities for all human society. So that's why I said in the introduction to my book, when somebody says we need to decolonize Earth, ask them, what is the colonial antecedent, the colonial causality of X? And when you are able to answer that question, it does not end there, because colonialism is not a unique. There are different forms of colonialism, there are different histories of colonialism, and colonialism has come from different eras. We had Byzantine colonialism in North Africa, we had Roman colonialism in North Africa, and then Arab colonialism came there. And then in other parts of the world, you also have different kinds of colonialism. You have Japan and South and Korea, for instance. So what colonialism is an issue when you want to decolonize Earth. That's the first part. And when you're able to identify, you want to show that Earth is neither cause, condition, influence, determined by colonialism. Again, remind yourself in coming to colonialism. So this kind of precision, I want to see, because if you are offering a view of colonialism, how will explain phenomena and all that? I want you to be clear, concise, precise as possible in making the case. The decolonizing discourse is rise of this level. And that is what I said. Decolonization too is a manufacture for confusion, not for elimination. And that is the decolonization discourse that I hope we can bury. And the reason why I say that is that, as I was telling someone earlier today and in my speech yesterday, it is destroying the future of scholarship in the continent. Because you have more and more now. Nobody is doing substantive work. Everybody wants to decolonize. And when that happens, the very important work, and some of that work is what I'm going to share with you in the next few minutes this afternoon, that needs to be done. It's not being done. And no one loses for Africa. And no one gains from that industry except its promoters who get all kinds of positions and get reputations that honestly I don't think have been to each their own. So that is the general ruling under which, and specifically this afternoon, what I want to do is to say that people may not be amazed, but what my people are busy decolonizing, mostly for the audience out here, life is happening behind their backs in Africa. And the life that is happening behind their backs does not really resemble or have much connection to what they are selling to people out here. And the focus for me is part of my continuing work on modernity and its relevance and importance for Africa. And my focus here today turns on political philosophy, individual rights, and the fundamental commitment to the inviolate dignity of every human being. And my point is that the decolonizing industry has nothing to say about any of these issues because they are too busy chasing slides. And that's what I'm going to be talking about. I argued in my book that with the conclusion of what I call decolonization 1, colonialism ended in the continent. Ironically, the only subsisting case of colonialism in the continent is Morocco's continuing colonial adventure in Western Sahara against African and world opinion, and most important, the wishes of the Sahrawi people. No review of my book that I'm aware of so far has suggested that I am wrong on this score. Some have taken issue with my elucidation of neocolonialism. Again, none so far has suggested that neocolonialism is qualitatively continuous with colonialism. And none has dared argue against the alternative interpretations I offered in the book of Nkrumah's characterization of neocolonialism, much less Obafemi Awolowo's account of the same phenomenon. Others have merely asserted that I'm discounting the continuing impact of colonialism on the continent. I don't have the time, but I have something here against one of the gurus of decolonization who said that I am not taking seriously the continuities in the discontinuities of colonialism. And I'm going, what am I supposed to understand with that? And then later, he accused me of not taking seriously the grammar of liberation that decolonizing discourse offers. And I'm wondering, liberation for what? Because if my thesis about Africa's second struggle for freedom is right, Africans are no longer marching. I don't believe whatever you're reading about Niger, Mali, about Burkina Faso, and Guinea. Africans are not marching against France. They are marching against their own rulers. And it's a very critical distinction that we need to make. And if you want to argue that those rulers continue to be under the thumb of France, of Britain, or any other place, then you have to acknowledge, concede what I said in my book. If after 60 years of independence, nothing has changed where that is concerned, we have only two options. Either we agree that the racists are right, that Africans are permanent children whose will is always bent by other people, or we say that Africans are grown adults who make lousy choices. And if it is the latter, then we need to make arguments with one another about how we start making those choices. But if it is the former, and we think, and this came up in the earlier session today, and my argument always is that when all is said and done, especially when it concerns adults, and it came up yesterday in Mass too, and somebody said to me, sometimes when people just have to deal with survival, they don't have a choice. And I said, when I read the history of the working class movement, there were times before people became reconciled to lining up to get the dough, when they would rather starve than go and get the dough, because getting the dough was against the dignity that they have as workers. And that identity was very important to them. And my point is, in a different work where I polemicized against aid to Africa, the continent is a continent of beggars. And I don't know how that says anything about African dignity or about our agency. And in case people don't realize, no country has ever developed as a result of aid. But when you look everywhere in Africa right now, nobody talks about doing anything without talking about their partners. No, you don't have partners when you don't bring anything to the table. Those you call partners are humoring you. And they know who calls the tunes. And then when you turn around and say that, well, they won't let us do something, well, stop looking up to them and do something, and then mobilize your people to ensure that if they come for you, other people will rise in your place to preserve the integrity of your country, of your economy, of your life, and of your people. That's where I'm coming from. So when I talk about Africa's second struggle for freedom, the first struggle for freedom was to push out the colonizers. So that's why I said decolonization ended when we got independence. When Awolowo said, neo-colonialism is what we do to ourselves. That's what he wrote. Neo-colonialism is what we do to ourselves when we do not use the power that was freed for us as a result of the struggle for independence to actually change the nature of our relationship with all those other people. And I try in the book to say, there's a way in which Nkrumah was also saying to us when he was talking about neocolonialism, watch out because we've gotten rid of them, but they may look for other ways to cycle back to get what they used to have, and we have to be on the lookout. So in a way, there's a convergence between, Awolowo and Nkrumah, on that point. But the way people read Nkrumah, and I'm sure wrongly, is that neocolonialism means neocolonialism never ended. So why call it by a new name? If it's the same, why call it by a new name? If it's a new reality, then it must have other causal, elements behind it. So I'm not going to spend my little time, on that. So what exactly is the second struggle for freedom? I first introduced the idea of a second struggle for freedom into my work in an op-ed I published in a now defunct Nigerian newspaper as a way to make sense of the then still breaking Arab-African Spring in 2011, long before the decolonizing trope attained prominence. I have in the intervening period become fully convinced that what I used then as a heuristic device captures the reality of a new dawn in African life and thought, that I remain convinced even now is not being accorded the attention it deserves. In Against Decolonization, my book, I identified two senses of decolonization, and I just, explained those to you. Even if we find that the erstwhile colonial overlords continue to dominate the politics and economics of the former colonies, it is implausible to say that the single principal or best explanation for that outcome is colonialism. This is where the issue of the agency of the ex-colonized demands attention. If the latter's will is so weak or so addled by colonialism such that nothing they do could overcome the dominance of their former rulers in the post-independence period, where then lies the capacity, beyond a lot of ink and depleted forests, of decolonizing discourse to arm them with this strength to take control of their own destinies. I, on the contrary, am raising questions about agency and what role it plays in the current state of affairs. This is because, in my view, permanently assigning subalternity to Africans comes straight from a racist playbook and makes it impossible for us to acknowledge, work with, much less celebrate African agency and its many manifestations, trends, and tendencies. What I have styled Decolonization 1 coincides with what I earlier called the first struggle for freedom. This was the struggle fought by all parts of Africa for independence from colonialism and its depredations. People often lose sight of the reference to all parts of Africa because, for instance, when the spring was going on, I actually drew some gasps from my audience at a town hall event in Seattle, Washington in February 2011, when I spoke of the Arab African Spring. And this because of the artificial separation of the continent, both in the literature and in the global, including African imagination. Yes, the North Africans secured independence earlier than it appears in the rest of the continent. One very good example of this dubious bifurcation of the continent is every time people announce, oh, Ghana was the first African country to get independence. Hello? Egypt? Sudan? What? But then they qualify Black country. How do you separate that? And then they say sub-Saharan. And I've polemicized against all three in different works. And sometimes people don't realize the idea of sub-Saharan Africa as proper Africa actually came from one of the most disreputable sources you can think of. It came from Hegel's philosophy of history. And he didn't introduce it for noble reasons. He introduced it because he wanted to claim Egypt for what he calls European Africa. So every time Africans are so happy to talk about sub-Saharan Africa, I just laugh inside. Because it's a lot of illiteracy. And people get so used to it, they cannot think of describing it in any other way. Africans wanted the freedom to order their own affairs as they see fit. They did not want to be ruled by any government that they had no hand in installing. They wanted their human dignity restored from the battering it had taken under colonial rule. They wanted governments that were responsible and responsive to them. Above all, they wanted to be free. So here's Kwame Nkrumah on that. And he wrote, in our struggle for freedom, parliamentary democracy was as vital an aim as independence. Kwame Nkrumah, author of Conscientism, the Marxist, the African personality guy, and the one that everybody loves to quote on neocolonialism. He said, in our struggle for freedom, parliamentary democracy was as vital an aim as independence. The two were inseparable. It was not our purpose to rid the country of the colonial regime in order to substitute an African tyranny. Think of the irony that he ended up being one of those tyrants later, after having written this earlier in his career.
Okay. We wanted to free our people from arbitrary rule and to give them the freedom to choose the kind of government they felt would best serve their interests and enhance their welfare. I am not sure that this preoccupation with freedom was as salient in the founding of the current AU under the imprimatur of the likes of Muammar Gaddafi, Robert Mugabe, Yoweri Museveni, Hosni Mubarak, one and all personifications of an African tyranny, and other authoritarian and dictatorial types. And a few months ago, the Chinese Communist Party set up a party school in Uganda. And I'm sure to train future dictators, future one-party apparatchiks, you know. And the reason why this is important to me is that this is the Africa of Nkrumah that I read that you don't find in the decolonizing discourse. Because parliamentary democracy is supposed to be a Western contraption. And liberalism is supposed to be part and parcel of the colonial legacy. And I'm going to be reading somebody again for you from West Africa, from Nkrumah's country again, writing in the late 19th and early 20th century, making similar points about freedom. And I want to expand the horizon of our discourse to take very seriously the heterodoxies, the heterogeneities that are present in African life and thought. Unfortunately, once independence was obtained, Africa's rulers, including Nkrumah, decided that the struggle for freedom was over and done with. They proceeded to put in place all manner of political contraptions, all designed to subvert and deny the freedom of their people, turn their citizens to subjects, substituted their wills for those of their people when it came to the installation of governments all across the continent. Any more trucking with freedom? No. They had their coats of arms, their flags, their national anthems, and so on. It was almost as if they thought that the struggle they had led for independence did not include, and this is the key for me, the freedom of individual citizens to have, hold, and seek to realize their own conceptions of the good life. The proverbial freedom to be let alone, especially by their governors. The impermissibility of governmental interference with the details of their daily lives, limits on the powers of government, and the sanctity of their dignity and their life. Watching the images in diverse media across the continent since the spring, the interviews with young and old, men and women from all walks of life at the barricades, it was clear back then that much more than the chronic economic and other problems that they had to deal with daily, paramount in their demands was their absolute insistence that they must be free. When Mohamed Bouazizi committed the brave act of self-immolation that triggered the Tunisian revolution, he wasn't dying for country, ethnic group, or religion. He could no longer take the repeated assault on his freedom and dignity, as well as that of his fellow countrymen and women. Therein lies the ultimate lesson of the current movements for change in both Africa and the rest of the world. I ask, what's decolonization got to do with it? And the rest of the world is not put there gratuitously. Part of what I argued in this book, especially in the final chapter, is that the political struggles that are going on in Africa now are just African versions of the political struggles that are going on in other parts of the world, and I named them. Thailand, Hong Kong, China, Turkey, Eswatini, which is the only absolute monarchy that is still existing, in the continent. So in the same way that young people in Thailand are telling the king, no, we own the land, you don't. Young people in Eswatini are telling the king, we own the country, you don't. And their playbooks are very similar. It's all about being ruled by governments that they have authored. And where does that principle come from? It's from modernity. And when, as decolonizers, you already donated modernity to Europe and the West, then you have to say those who are asking for that, like me, are still colonized. And that is a lot of the argument that people make, against me, that you want us to be westernized, even though I wrote a whole book where I made a distinction between modernity, westernization, and colonialism. And I argued that contrary to received wisdom, it was not colonialism that brought modernity to Africa. In West Africa specifically, it was Christianity. And when formal colonialism came, it aborted the transition to modernity that was underway under the inspiration of Protestant Christianity. The book has been out for 13 years. No one has yet come out to say that my thesis was wrong. Maybe this audience? I'll be grateful. In previous iterations of the dominant idea in this presentation, I have been concerned with writing into the record the rich history of African thinkers' engagement with the idea of freedom derived from modernity, ever since the 19th century origins of modern African social and political philosophy, through the independence struggle till now. Here is a sampler. This is Joseph C. Kesili Hayford from Ghana. We are living in a new age and a new order of which we who participate in them are hardly aware. One important element of this new order is the growing consciousness of our race the world over, of which practical statesmanship must take cognizance. Among world problems today is the appeal which goes from the heart of the African to be accorded certain rights which are common to humanity. We claim that we have the right to our own opinion and to the express of it. We say that we have passed the childhood stage, and that much as we appreciate the concern of our guardians, the time has come for us to take an intelligent, active part in the guiding of our own national destiny. We claim, in common with the rest of mankind, that taxation without representation is a bad thing. As far as I'm concerned, you can say that to the British under colonialism. You can say that to the government in Nigeria today too, if you have not elected that government. So it is not a racial thing. It is a question of the grants of legitimacy for the mode of governance that takes place in a place. And it says, equally do we hold with others that there should be free scope for the members of the community, irrespective of creed or color, to hold any office under the crown or flag to which a person's merits entitle him or her. And when you come to the literature and African political philosophy throughout the 20th century, freedom was a continuing theme. In a previous paper, I'll just give you an idea of how prominent the idea of freedom was. That Africans never gave up on freedom is attested by the prevalence of that word in the discourse of Africa's independence struggle and its aftermath. Obafemi Awolowo wrote Path to Nigerian Freedom. Kwame Nkrumah wrote Towards Colonial Freedom and I Speak of Freedom. Oginga Odinga lamented the unfulfillment of the promise of freedom after independence was won in Noche Uhuru, which is Swahili word for freedom. Nelson Mandela knew that there was no easy walk to freedom. His original biography before, the later one. Julius Nyerere wrote severally, on freedom and development, freedom and unity, and Kenneth Kaunda asserted Zambia must be free. These and others are some of the basic texts, and it was not just in writing. It was also in music, because I always love to do this. I did it in the introduction to my book. E.T. Mensah, Nigeria's Victor Laya, and Adeolu Akinsoya. The idea of freedom was very prominent in high life music, the genre of music, that was popular across the West African coast. And people wrote calypsos, for freedom. And even more indigenous modes of making music, in my part of Nigeria, in Yoruba, people talked about freedom, about the struggle for it. And we had the dramatist, Hubert Ogunde, who actually wrote many plays that were publicly performed in the anti-colonial struggle and in the name of freedom, when it was clear to him after independence that that promise of freedom was not being realized. And we don't find this reflected in the literature that just tells us that nothing has happened, in Africa. And here is Awólọ́wọ̀'s most significant, point about freedom. He says, as we planned for Nigeria's independence, we were fully conscious that freedom from British rule does not necessarily connote freedom for individual Nigerian citizens. I and most of my colleagues are Democrats by nature and socialists by conviction. We believe in the democratic way of life, equality under the law, respect for the fundamental rights of individual citizens, and the existence of independent and impartial tribunals where these rights could be enforced. We believe that the generality of the people should enjoy this life and do so in reasonable abundance. The most detestable feature of British administration was that the governed had no say in the appointment of those who governed them. A Nigerian administration by Nigerians must be erected on the general consent and the united goodwill of the majority of the people. In my view, there can be no satisfactory alternative to this. So for those who think that military rule is a satisfactory alternative, here is an African thinker, politician, and one of the leaders of independence who was very clear. And later on, he did work under a military regime. I have something in the lecture about that. And he quit as soon as it was clear to him that the national emergency that made him say yes to them was over. And this was Nigeria's civil war. And afterwards, when he failed repeatedly to be elected president of Nigeria, he declared the worst civilian regime is always better than the best military administration. That was Awólọ́wọ̀ in Nigeria. So this is not something that I'm making up. I am talking about some of our most important thinkers for whom this is, very, very important. So what does all this have to do with, what I call the current situation that is going on? So let me read out to you some things that I want you to please pay attention to. In Nigeria recently, a young woman ran away from home and sued her father, who was trying to marry her off to a suitor she did not fancy. The judge in Sharia court granted her relief, but not quite because he recognized the individuality of the young lady or her autonomy. But he said he reiterated the father's right to marry her off, but pleaded with her father to be patient with his daughter and try to persuade his daughter to his point of view. That's one incident. Two, we have inter-ethnic conflicts all across the continent. And people quickly say, oh, we have artificial boundaries imposed, in 1884, 85, by the colonial authorities. And I always ask people, is there a single country in the world with natural boundaries? All boundaries are artificial. And what happened in Africa was not special, was not peculiar to Africa. The Arabian Peninsula was all carved up by colonialists. And some of the countries that we know there today never existed as countries in the past. So again, there's nothing special, nothing peculiar, about Africa. And many parts of Asia, can sing the same song. So that cannot be the principal explanation for why we have inter-ethnic conflicts. And if the kind of idea that people want to say that we used to live in peace with one another. If you ever know the history, the sociology, the anthropology of various societies, and you believe that, either you're not a serious scholar or you really enjoy being lied to. 3, the killing of people accused of blasphemy in the northern part of Nigeria with nary a hand raised by the state against those who perpetrated such crimes. So my question is, what are blasphemy laws doing in a country that calls itself secular and a republic? And in case people forget, as I reminded people yesterday in Maastricht, the United States used to have jurisdictions also where blasphemy was a crime. And that's the United States. And over time, they discovered that there was something incompatible between being the modern state that they claimed and the state enforcing the religious rules of one faction on other factions that do not buy into it. So again, this is not an African thing. What are we still doing with that? And recently, in a city in central Nigeria, people who are Yoruba, Orisha adherents wanted to hold their festival, and the ruler, the so-called traditional ruler of the city said, no, you cannot do that because this is an Islamic city. So the reason why I'm giving you all these instances is because I want to juxtapose them with those large principles that Nkrumah and Awolowo were talking about in terms of how life is supposed to be led after independence has been won, when it comes to individual Africans leading lives of dignity, of freedom to be the authors of their own life scripts without having other people either preempt or make the transaction costs of those practices so prohibitive that they have to fold themselves under other people, and by so doing, lose their autonomy and their dignity as individuals. And then we have African rulers acting on behalf of their countries, ceding away huge portions of their land to foreign countries to grow food for export to the expropriating countries, even while the seller countries are unable to feed their own people from the same land. That scandal is beyond belief. And one of those countries, again, I will not name names, actually went to some of those people who want to buy land. If they're giving you trouble, in those other places, come, we'll give it to you for free with no conditions. So I can imagine, future decolonizers 70 years down the road have grandchildren and great-grandchildren now talking as if, the people who are buying that land right now forced African leaders to give it to them. We're not talking of old colonialism. There are no gunboats. These are African leaders who have no sense of self, who only live for the day, and who are setting up problems that lead to the undermining of the dignity of their own people for whatever reason. And the countries that are buying land, when I was saying it in the meeting earlier today, people say, oh, China has said, yeah, but not quite. And people say, I said, no. The tragedy of Africa right now, the countries buying land include Qatar, Dubai, South Korea, Oman. And what your scholars are doing is decolonizing. And all that stuff is going on that is sowing the seeds for continuing near permanent disrespect of African agency and African, personality. And then, you have Africans stashing their loot in foreign lands. So even when they steal the money, it's not stealing the money that is my problem. When you steal the money, I live in the United States. That's a country where corruption is an art and a science. But when you steal the money, you launder it. You invest. But Africans don't invest in their countries. The former vice president of Nigeria, who just lost his petition, yesterday, before a tribunal that, again, Awolowo was talking about, impartial, tribunal, which we should be working to make better and better for the benefit of our people, now maintains his residence in Dubai. And I am supposed to think that the most important thing is what, somebody somewhere in writes against me as an African, I don't care what they think. If I do my work and I do it well, my audience will find me. But when I waste my time chasing after them, then they define the parameters of what I'm going to talk about. I just let them alone. I write my own thinking. I think my own thing. And I hope that I reach some of the world in the name of the same Africa that all of us claim to be representing. And I am much more interested in educating the world about what Africans think, what they have thought, and how what they think can actually help a world that can use the wisdom of all its constituent elements, wherever those elements happen to reside. That is what drives, my own work. So I am arguing that in Africa right now, individual citizens, for the most part, are not getting to lead lives of freedom and dignity. And that is where our focus should be, and how we get to organize our countries, to organize our societies, so that, we can change that aspect when people live, And where this is concerned, I argue in this lecture, the freedom of the individual is absolute. Yes, in much of African scholarship, we are all supposed to be communalists. So what I just said now makes me not African, but Westerner. The freedom of the individual is absolute. The absoluteness of the freedom of the individual is best construed in the presumptive sense. It is similar to what we mean when we say that human beings are essentially free in modern philosophy. We do not ask human beings to show why they should be free. We ask those who wish to curb human freedom to show why humans should not be free. So there you find my answer to Museveni and his law making homosexuality a capital offense in Uganda. Because unless homosexuality is adversely affecting other individuals, it should not be the business of the state or of the society. And then people say to me, oh, but that's not our culture. Cultures don't trump rights. Only rights can trump rights. And as we're finding out in the US also, yes, the argument of many right-wing people is that, the character of our country is changing. And they're trying to use the law to enforce their own definition of what it is to be African. So again, I'm saying, I'm not talking about something that is peculiarly African. These are human things that these principles, these philosophies enable us to push back against. And one of the things that people also don't pay attention to is the presence of critical scholars of Islam in Africa who have been working on the idea of Islam and modernity. The two that I work with most, are Fatima Menesi, the late sociologist from Morocco, and her book, Islam and Democracy, The Fear of the West, and Abdullahi Ahmed An-Naim from Sudan, who wrote a book on Towards an Islamic Revolution, and has recently written another book on Islam and the constitutional state, and the secular state. And again, we are not arguing with these people and showing, where they are wrong, but they are trying to come up with ways to keep the integrity of the Islamic faith while being able to accommodate the kind of heterodoxy that laws of blasphemy do not permit. And those, for me, are scholarly engagements that we need, to be paying attention to. And to the extent that this issue of individual freedom is taken very seriously, then a whole lot of the laws that are made in many parts of Africa, especially when it concerns the legal system and putting the legal system under the thumb of the state and jailing people for insulting the person of the head of state. If you don't want to be insulted, don't become head of state. It's a public life. They're not coming to your living room to insult you. Present yourself. And when the public is looking at you, you cannot dictate how every member of the public looks at you. Some will think you are God, some will think you are ugly beyond belief. If you don't want that, sit in your room and don't present yourself. But then, you know, that is what we have in many parts. The guy in Senegal who was trying to get himself a third term, you know, after he could not prove that his opponent was guilty of rape because they went to court and he was released and all that, then he said, oh, he has dragged the name of the state in the mud, and that's why they must prosecute him. Welcome, Soviet Union, back in the day. And I am saying that this second struggle for freedom that Nkrumah wrote about, that Awolowo wrote about, that Kesili Eford anticipated in the 20s of the last century, this is what is on the table now. And this is what, for me, should be agitating us, if for no other reason, for the dignity of the littlest amongst us. If decolonizing has anything to say about that, I'll be open to being educated. Thank you all very much.